Great. Well, thank you all for joining today. Hello and welcome. This is a PLSA Policy Insights webinar. We're focusing on carbon emissions reporting. Thank you for tuning in. We'll be reviewing the TCFD reporting requirements for your scheme. This has been a key topic of discussion for all our PLSA scheme members. Some of you have been going through this exercise since last year. Others, the reporting requirements have been extended for schemes with 1 billion from the start of October. And just last week, we've heard that the government has launched a consultation for the LGPS to assess and report on climate-related risks in line with TCFD. My name is Martin Stepan. I've recently joined the PLSA as the events content manager, and I'm delighted to be joined by 3 experts who share their insights on TCFD experience so far and what we can expect in the coming months and next year. I'd like to welcome Karen Hurst, Senior Policy Advisor and Investment Stewardship at the PLSA, all matters related to TCFD. She's our local resident expert on all these matters. Mark Sherwin, Senior Advisor on Financial Reporting at the Investment Association, and Chandra Gopinathan, the Senior Investment Manager at Sustainable Ownership at Railpen. We have around 45 minutes for this session. Karen will first provide an overview on the TCFD reporting and what it means for your scheme. Chandra will give us some first hands-on experience of this exercise and what have been some of the lessons learnt. And Mark will explain how to use the Carbon Emissions Template, a nifty little tool developed by PLSA, Investment Association and the ABI to help simplify on TCFD reporting. We'd like to make this session as interactive as possible, so please do put your questions in the chat box or on the questions tab. I'll make sure to raise them with the experts. We'll also circulate the slides and the recording and the Q&A answers afterwards. So to take us through, Karen, if I can turn to you first, can you give us a quick overview of what does TCFD reporting mean and where do we stand at the moment?
Yes, of course. Thanks, Martin, and hello to everyone. I hope you're doing well today. So I thought I'd just maybe start. We've put up a slide here with just some basics on it. To be honest, I suspect anyone on this call is probably well aware of the sort of fundamentals of the TCFD framework. But just to give you some background, obviously this is a global framework that's been developed by a private sector task force. But what's different about this framework to, I think, all the other hundreds that we hear about is this is the one that I think a lot of sectors globally have really got behind. This has been adopted in the UK, or there's a roadmap in place where it's been adopted throughout the economy in the UK, and beyond that, it's also been sort of adopted voluntarily by a lot of major institutions and sort of bodies throughout the world. So it's something the PLSA's sort of decided to get behind as the go-to reporting framework as we sort of try and move the climate debate forward. So just to sort of flag that the framework itself is there's 11 disclosure recommendations across 4 pillars, which I've listed there: governance, strategy, risk management, and metrics and targets. I should just highlight that if you've already you're a bit ahead of yourselves in terms of choosing to report on this for the past few years, you should just be mindful that the government sort of set out its own expectations that are quite a bit more detailed than the guidance from the task force itself. So certainly you should ensure that you're checking what the legislative requirements are in the UK when you're doing this, and also that across different departments, helpfully they've been a bit different. So I'm assuming most people on this call today will be within the DWP's requirements on this, although I'm going to just run through what's happening in the LGPS. As Martin said, there's been some developments on that in the past week. So basically, if you have over 1 million assets under management from the 1st of October, you're now within the scope of these requirements. So you'll need to be producing a report within 7 months of your year end after October. One thing I think, and I should say, if you're a bit smaller than that, we don't actually know what the timeframes are. So I think that's subject to review next year, and the PLSA will obviously be engaging with all our members and making sure that their views are considered. If we could maybe just move on to the next slide, we run through some of the specifics of the DWP requirements. So yeah, so I think the first thing I would just flag is we often talk about it in terms of producing a TCFD report, but really what the government's seeking is evidence that this is being considered, that it's, you know, it's part of, it's really embodied by your organisation. It's a kind of ongoing consideration. It's not just a report that you publish once a year. In terms of some of the specifics that are published once a year, there's a requirement for scenario analysis every 3 years, not every year. In 2 scenarios they're asking schemes to look at there. There's also a requirement around scope 1, 2, 3 emissions reporting, albeit for scope 3, which is famously challenging. They recognise that may not be doable in the first year, and also that you can only report as far as you're able to, as they call it. They're requiring reporting on 3 metrics, and there's a new one this year. So if you're already done a report last year, you should be aware that there's a new forward-looking Paris alignment metric as well. It's required. They seek a sort of non-binding target. So in relation to one of those metrics, they're asking trustees to set themselves a target, really just to generate some discussion and to prompt some thinking about how the scheme is progressing on these issues. And what else would I would just, maybe one other thing I would flag is TPR and DWP and indeed some others have produced some really useful guidance on this, which I think is well worth getting stuck into if you're starting on this journey at the moment. I will, before we move on to questions, I thought, and I appreciate it's not how it was marketed, but we just wanted to run through the LGPS requirements, or the proposals, I should say. So if we move on to my final slide. So this is a consultation that was published just last week, and seeking to bring the requirements in for LGPS because they're within the jurisdiction of a different government department. We've been waiting on this a long time, over a year, so it's sort of welcome that things are moving forward. Largely the proposals are just as we expected them to be, and they're very similar to the DWP proposals. So if you're part of an LGPS administering authority and you've been planning, then certainly it appears that you've probably been doing the right things. The only thing I would maybe flag is there's an additional metric in those proposals that would be looking at data quality. So that's something to think about as well. The other thing just to say is the Department of Levelling Up Housing, Local Government, decided to bring this in one go, unlike the DWP, who obviously brought it in stages linked to the size of the scheme. So this would be, if these go ahead, this would be in place from the financial year 2023 for LGPS administering authorities of all sizes. So that's, at the moment, we're just sort of digesting that, and we'll obviously, the PLSA will be responding to that consultation in due course. If obviously you've got any questions, do get in touch about that one. There's some other, I mean, obviously today we're wanting to look at lessons learned from the first scope. I guess if that's the end of my slide, so I don't know if you want to take them down, Molly, thank you. But yeah, maybe some sort of themes that we've picked up in our various travels. Maybe we'll tease some of these out in the panel discussion, but I think firstly at this point we've not really had any kind of feedback from the regulators on how the first reporting tranche has gone. So they've certainly indicated that they're not aware of any problems. We're not aware of any fines being issued, but we'll keep an eye on that in terms of what the government's feedback is, or sorry, the regulators' feedback is. Some of the challenges that, I mean, famously data is obviously the area that's lacking. Pension schemes have sort of undergone this journey in advance of many of the other elements in the investment chain, and that certainly caused a huge amount of challenge. I think moving forward, it'll be interesting to see how their understanding of the climate risk evolves based on data, which is obviously improving, but some way to go. I think in terms of some of the asset classes, in terms of how we report on and consider them, there's clearly some debate to be had on how we handle some of the more challenging ones. Sovereign debt has obviously been a problematic area, and many are frustrated that the sort of suggested means of calculating that is perhaps resulting in some skewed data. So I'm aware that some of those who published it in the first round just sort of excluded this because they weren't convinced it could bring any kind of meaningful information. And I think for me, I've been sort of keeping my eye on media scrutiny. There's been a lot of debate about the regulations and the requirements and how, you know, burdensome or otherwise they were, but we've not seen a lot of scrutiny on the actual content of the reports. And I noticed just last week, I keep an eye on the trade press, I was noted that there was the first article I'd noticed that was really getting into the detail of some of the reports. So I think that'll be interesting to see how that moves forward. But obviously I'm keen to hear sort of Chandra from a practitioner perspective, how he's handled some of these, and obviously keen to take any questions.
Great, thank you very much, Karen. We'll come over to Chandra in just a moment. He'll give us the highlights from his experience of the past very, very busy year. Karen, we've got a couple of LGPS members on the line and might be interested to know, you know, in terms of the regulation that's been put forward, it seems to be fairly similar for this community. But we also know that LGPS is slightly different grouping. So do you expect any different sort of treatment moving forward? How do you see the sort of the evolution of the application moving forward here?
I think it's a really interesting question. I think, I mean, the first thing to flag is LGPS schemes would not be subject to any fines, which is sort of worked into the regulations for the private sector. They're just sort of banking that any failure to do so would result in so much bad press that no one would do it. I mean, obviously our LGPS members, they have long existed in a slightly different environment in terms of scrutiny. They really do get a lot of scrutiny on you know, climate and other ethical matters. So I know we had a meeting of our local authority committee yesterday, and they were sort of aware that how they move forward, well, you know, they're expecting a lot of scrutiny, and rightly so, and they're very keen to make sure that they get it right. And a couple of things, and at the moment, you know, the consultation is very new, so we're still sort of mulling some of this, but as well, there's a sort of requirement on for a scheme-wide report to be published by the Scheme Advisory Board, and I know some members are sort of worried about the kind of aggregation of some of the data, and you know, how will that be interpreted? Will that be skewed in some way? So certainly I want to think about, but I know you know, as I say, for reasons that we probably don't understand, but probably political, this consultation has been delayed for some time, and I know the LGPS members are sort of just keen to get moving on this. So I think it's a really good step.
Great, thank you. We'll watch this space. As Karen said, we'll certainly we'll be responding to the consultation. So any further questions you do have, please get in touch with us. Chandra, let's move over to you. You've been at the helm here. You've been working extensively, you know, on this from a first-hand experience. You know, what are your high-level moments? You know, what's perhaps surprised you the most, and what have you found most challenging here?
Thank you, Marcin, and thank you for the introduction, Karen. I think Karen's touched on a few of the issues, challenges that exist within TCFD at the moment. Well, I'll just go over some of the surprises. I wouldn't really say it's as much of a bad surprise necessarily. It's been the detail, the extent of detail around the guidance, both from TCFD itself and from the DWP, also has been fairly, and TPR has been fairly detailed. So you just need to take the time to go through some of that stuff. It is a time-consuming process, but the guidance is fairly extensive. So that is quite reassuring. And we have had good interactions with the regulator and the DWP as well in terms of feedback, in case there has been any questions around, okay, how do we think about this? How do we think about that? And it's been a fairly welcome process. So I would advise asset owners who have any sort of doubts or confusion as it relates to the guidance itself to approach. So it is a fairly relaxed and proactive process, which has been that way. The other thing, there are some things which are, I'd say, minor surprises, if you will, where we would have expected things to be a bit different. But if you think about it holistically, then it does make sense. So, like, for example, it is mandatory to report for schemes to report TCFD on TCFD, but corporates, particularly private companies, don't have to report it until next year. So it feels a little bit like a cart before the horse. But when you speak to the regulators, you do realize that this is more holistic. You don't want this to stop. You don't want the absence of data or the absence of mandatory reporting from corporates to necessarily stop the process for schemes. It doesn't necessarily have to happen one after the other. It can happen together, and there will be teething issues, but the idea is to get everybody along on the journey together. The other thing is also around the focus around emissions. There's a lot of focus around emissions, scope 1 and 2, scope 3, what the definitions are, what the methodology is. There is also the focus on, we think that's important for sure, but it is also a snapshot. So that's part of the picture. So the regulators have touched on forward alignment, portfolio alignment, as Karen touched on. I think schemes should think about that in more detail, because that is coming in 2023. Not just from a regulatory reporting perspective, but also from a true climate risk management perspective, to start thinking about, this is where my portfolio is today, but this is what the mix around the alignment looks like. Because if I have a portfolio of entirely clean companies, or companies in sectors which are relatively emissions light, but they're all sort of not aligned and not doing anything on their climate side, then that makes it a challenge going forward. So you will have issues 2 years down the road. So just to sort of be aware of that get working on that bit as well. In terms of key challenges, I'd say, emission. I'll touch on data a little bit and come back to it a little later, because it is widely talked about, and rightly so. It is a challenge for sure. So emissions data, in terms of, particularly for private companies, for real estate, for infrastructure, for sovereign debt, as Karen said, I think that is a big question mark at the moment. So how do you, what do you do with your portfolio of, let alone emerging market sovereign bonds, even gilts? How do you report on it? How do you sort of track that in? Because that theoretically could account for a big portion of your emissions overall. So there's that bit. But I'll combine a little bit of the challenges and the sort of takeaways, if you will, together. The one thing we did when we started the process, it was obviously overwhelming, and say, look, oh my God, this is a whole lot. How are we going to resource it? How are we going to budget it? What are we going to sort of? So there's that. But the more we had these conversations with the regulators, and the more we sort of took a step back and viewed it a bit more holistically, you try to understand it a bit more holistically. It's really about schemes and trustees getting a handle around their exposure. So I'd say, the first and foremost, make sure, whether you're internal or externally managed, I would make sure that you have a good understanding of the strategic asset allocation that your schemes have, the sectors that your scheme is invested in, and the geographies that you're invested in. I think those three are the basic building block for any trustee and any scheme to sit there and understand whether you're doing it with an internal team or an external team. If your asset managers don't have that information or aren't giving it to you, ask for it. I think get that in place first. The other thing is, there is a lot of information out there in terms of industry collaboratives, in terms of literature, in terms of methodologies, etc. A bit too much, but I would definitely encourage the schemes and their respective asset managers to definitely join the initiatives, whether it's IIGCC, whether it's even PLSA's own initiatives on some of this stuff, where the collaboration is king or queen here. It's absolutely crucial, and it can make your lives a lot easier. There is guidance out there on sectors. There's guidance out there on metrics, choice of metrics. There's guidance out there on pathways and portfolio alignment and all of those sorts of good things, and even offsetting. There's best practice principles out there. So if you need help thinking about it, if your asset managers need help thinking about it, get into those initiatives and make sure you have a representative from the asset manager who is looking at this. The third thing I'll say is, it's not just about data, it's about control as well. Because one of the things that you don't see with sectors, you're going to have a lot of managers and particularly in real estate, infrastructure, and private equity come and tell you, oh, we can't give you the data because we don't have it. The company hasn't given it to us. So fine, that is fine. But even for stuff that is for information that is available from the company, you do have certain sectors that are already challenged. So for private equity in particular, if you see, private markets GPs barely give you revenue and EBITDA information, let alone emissions information. So it's important to make sure that you have the agreements in place, the IMAs in place, where you either have the language for getting data, or have a side agreement saying, this is our climate reporting requirement, and this is our stewardship reporting requirement, and this is what we need, and try and get that in. You may not be as lucky to get everything you want in there, but I would say get started on that bit, because what you don't ask for, you definitely don't get. You may get a percentage of it, but I think having that control is really, really essential. And again, coming back to the industry sources that are there, you do have, we did help, Railpen did help co-author the IGCC Net Zero Stewardship Toolkit. So there is a pretty good document which gives investors a good idea of, okay, how do you start on stewardship, and also have ready templates available where, you do have a reporting and a stewardship template in particular, and PLSA I is going to talk more about the PLSA data template as well. So stuff like that, I would make use of those and pass that along to managers. And last but not least, I'd say within the scheme itself, do get your stakeholders involved sooner rather than later. So when you're talking, because you're talking multi-asset classes, you're talking whether internal or externally managed. If you're internal, then you obviously have various different teams, real estate, public markets, all of those. Break it down and share the burden a little bit, I'd say, because once you have an idea of what you want on a standardized basis, I would sort of make sure, not just from a risk and governance perspective, but also from a responsibility sharing perspective, it becomes a lot easier. Because if somebody's asking their managers for all sorts of information on the portfolio performance anyway, this is just an add-on. So you just stick that in, make sure you can get that, and make your life easier and everybody else's as well. So I'd stop there and see if you have any questions.
Thank you, Chandra. Yes, so yeah, if you do have any questions for Chandra, Karen, and Mark, please do put them in. Chandra, thank you for that. That was very very concise, a lot of detail in there. So yeah, certainly get a handle on your strategic exposure, data control, certainly very, very important. Engaging with asset managers and the various initiatives out there. There is obviously, so many people are working on this, so there's certainly lots of tools around. Before I move to Karen, you can tell us a little bit more about some of the experience that you've heard from other PLSA members and how different or how similar the experience has been with Chandra. Chandra, if you were to do something different now, what would be that one thing that you would do differently?
I don't know if I just necessarily just point to one thing. There's many things that we could have done differently, and I would say that, and if I had to pick one most important thing, I would say it is about getting your ducks in order in terms of standardized information of what you need and getting your stakeholders involved. I think those are the two things I'd say which are key. I think make sure you have I think those two are probably most important. So get your individual asset managers or your individual investment teams in, give them the standardized template that they need in terms of collecting data, or inserting templates, or inserting IMA language saying this is what you need for control. And I'd say try and look at the big picture as much as possible, because rather than just looking at, and don't sort of mistake forest for the trees sort of thing, try and look at the big picture in terms of making it as decision useful for yourself as well as a scheme. Because yes, it is a regulatory reporting requirement, but when you speak to the regulators as well, what they want trustees to have a handle on is the scheme's risks. So as long as you can do that for the scheme and for yourself, you'll be doing yourself a favor longer term. It may not appear as something that you are going to use tomorrow, but as climate data evolves, as reporting evolves, as disclosure gets better, ISSP comes in, all of those things happen, you will be in a much better situation to fully integrate climate risk and fully integrate it into your systems and your investment process. And hopefully over time, it can drive investment decision making as well. So that's the intent anyway. So don't miss the big message for just the detail. So
great, thank you, Chandra. Mark, we'll come to you in just a moment about some of our initiatives that you've been working on from the Investment Association. Karen, you've just heard from Chandra a lot of different good stories, good feedback loop that we've had with engagement. What have you been hearing on the ground?
Well, firstly, that was such good advice from Chandra on what that, particularly in terms of making use of existing initiatives. There's a huge amount happening by various different people. Different collaborations are coming together to try and transition pathways, that sort of thing. And I think, one thing I've heard some people talk about is the cost of doing so. And I think in the early days of the DWP's consultation, they asked us if we thought it would be about 20,000, and I think most people who've undergone this process have a chuckle when they hear that, because obviously there's quite a lot to be done, and that's costing money. On the flip side, I would say that trying to see this as much as, in terms of being a sort of startup cost as far as possible, because this is really, in the first year or two, it's going to be at its most painful, but hopefully moving forward, particularly as as these sort of as the data improves, as more people come within the scope of the various different requirements, it will get easier, and hopefully it will be a really positive journey. But it feels quite early days, I have to say. I think quite a lot of the people who were doing it in the first year are still recovering, but I think that certainly what I've picked up is there's all these frustrations, and as Chandra says, it's easy to get bogged down in sort of the challenges. But I certainly feel that those who have started the journey, they sort of feel positive about the conversation that's prompted within the organisation, and the buy-in it's enabled them to achieve, and particularly with trustees, and just a sort of feeling that they're getting on top of all the different things they need to think about. So hopefully we can sort of encourage everyone to view it as positively as possible despite the challenges.
Thanks, Karen. So it's not all doom and gloom and extra work and cumbersome long hours looking at different spreadsheets. Mark, you've been leading some of the work here on the carbon emissions template. Again, great resource for you to use when trying to understand and how to follow in the TCFD reporting style aspects. Can you tell us a little bit more about the background, why it was sent up, and how can we really use this template moving forward?
Sure, yes, thank you. Obviously, I represent the investment managers that are providing the data for schemes here. It's great to hear Chandra talking from the perspective of a scheme, standardisation being top of his list of priorities, because I think that's good for schemes. It's good for us as asset managers as well. If we can develop things to push out in a standard format that helps all schemes in the same way, that's good and improves the processes for doing that and the robustness of those processes. It provides the schemes with a standard expectation of what they're going to receive. And within the working group that comes from the three bodies, the PLSA, us at the IA, and also the ABI as well on the insurance side, who have a significant role in the contract-based market particularly, there's been a lot of thought going into the detail of the methodologies. And so, as well as specifying which metrics are reported, there is, particularly on emissions, a great deal of thought and documentation behind the way you actually calculate the figure. So schemes can rely on what they get from their asset managers through this template being consistent across all of their portfolios, which obviously then allows more reliable aggregation of that information. Looking at the template itself, and we've got the slide here on the screen, there's a lot of information on here. It summarises a template with something in the order of 80 data items. So it's going to be a slightly busy slide. But if I talk through it, going down the left-hand side, first of all, we've got some general information at the start of the template that identifies the fund or the portfolio concerned, when the data relates to, and so on. The template's then divided up by asset class, and the individual asset classes are listed on the right, and I'll come to those in a minute. But for each asset class, we report on the value of assets in that class, and then the value of those assets that have emissions data provided. And this provides you a view of the level of coverage, and it could be very different for different asset classes. I think we expect the listed sector to have a better coverage and a more reliable data than private equity markets, for example. Within the data that's provided, we give a view on the quality of that data, whether it's data reported individually by each company, or whether it is an estimate based on a sectoral average or an internal estimate from the asset manager themselves. So that tells you about how much data you've got and whether that's good quality data, the coverage of your portfolio. We then obviously have the key figure, the greenhouse gas emissions, and as I said, there's detailed methodology for that calculation. That's the key figure that fulfills the obligation for schemes to obtain the data. We also provide the additional metrics that are calculated from the data in here on carbon footprint and the carbon intensity. And then for each asset class, there's some narrative fields, so we can provide explanations of the estimates, or why there's estimates being used, or what might be done in the future to improve the estimates or improve the quality of the data, and finally a free text field for any other information that might be necessary. And that chunk of information repeats through the template for each asset class. It's also disclosed separately for scope 1 and 2 emissions from scope 3 emissions, because of the likely different coverage and quality of those two camps, and also because of the different timing of when they're first required to be reported, with the scope 3 emissions coming a year later than the others. Looking at the individual asset classes, we've broken this down following the guidance that comes from DWP. We've got the corporate sector first of all, which is probably the key area where we have emissions data available. We've also got the sovereign debt section, which, as we've heard already from both Karen and Chandra, this is a more challenging area. It's more difficult to figure out what is the right piece of data, and it's probably difficult for schemes, having got the data, to know what you can actually do in terms of managing things as a result of that data. Nevertheless, following the DWP guidance, the approach taken is based on looking at production-based or consumption-based emissions. The guidance from the TCFD covers that approach. It also looks at the more government-orientated approach, where you think of government and government buildings and government activities as a source of scope 1 and 2 emissions. You get very, very different results from those two approaches, and it's an area where the working group will continue to deliberate on how best to cover that area. Private equity is separated out from the listed corporate sector, largely because the coverage is likely to be very, very different, and so it's felt helpful to be able to understand where the coverage is better and where it's worse, and give it a little bit more insight into that. And then finally, real assets, mainly real estate, is covered in a different way, looking at the energy use of buildings primarily in the real estate sector. So that's a whirlwind through what the template contains. The key thing about it being, as I said at the beginning, it's standardizing the data into a format that gives enough information for a scheme to be able to meet its regulatory obligations. It may not cover every possible metric that's listed in the DWP guidance, but it covers enough to meet full compliance with the regulatory requirements.
Great, thank you, Mark. It's as I said, it's a fantastic tool. Please do check it out. We'll be sending around links on the various websites if you want to take a look and download the Excel spreadsheet. And as Mark said, it's it's a journey, it's a process. It's looking at how we're trying to standardize all the right data and make it fit the needs. Mark, we do have some exciting updates though coming up. As I said, this is a journey. There are developments happening. What do you see? What are the next steps?
Yes, well, certainly when we formed the working group this time last year, we envisaged at least 2 phases. I think we're very convinced now there'll be more than 2 phases. So that the first phase delivered the template that I've just talked through. The second phase will necessarily bring into the fold the need for an alignment metric, the fourth metric that's been introduced this year, and look at the best way of doing that. Initial deliberations in the working group have focused on keeping that relatively straightforward and simple, looking at the binary targets approach, looking at the proportion of your portfolio that's signed up to some form of alignment, as opposed to the more complex, for example, implied temperature rises kinds of calculations, where you've got complex methodologies. They're likely to be proprietary methodologies and therefore different with different managers. Those methodologies are still developing, and the data required for them is not always readily out there. And so we felt within the working group, and to be clear, that working group, this is coming very much from the schemes participating within that working group. We're keen that something like the binary target is more simplistic, but it will allow that to be combined across different portfolios to give a kind of scheme level view. Similarly, with the other additional metrics, we've steered away in the past from things like climate value at risk, and the DWP rules have brought in some more focus on looking at proportions of assets that are exposed in certain ways to certain types of risk, physical risk, transition risk, and perhaps climate opportunities. Again, proportions of assets in each of those buckets is something that can be looked at a scheme level by combining data from underlying portfolios, and so we'll look at those. And finally, as we've talked already, looking ahead to potentially other asset classes, two areas. Obviously, there'll be ongoing work on sovereign debt, and the other area is everything we've covered so far is about financed emissions. It's about you own some of a company and therefore you're funding its activities and hence its emissions, but also facilitated emissions. So you might have an exposure to a sector or a country or something through derivatives exposure, which doesn't in itself finance any emissions at all. It's a derivative is just you taking a view on the movement of the price of an underlying asset and someone else taking an opposing view and making a call on that. So there's no actual financing of emissions through derivatives, but they could be exposing the scheme to risk as a result of climate change.
Great, thank you, Mark. So I'm just conscious of time. We've got the last 5 minutes. If you have any burning questions, please do put them forward. We've got last couple of minutes. I'm just going to go to our esteemed panel here, and what are the sort of high-level views you have when it comes down to regulation in this field? What are the key cornerstones? Mark, you were just talking about some of the updates from your side. Karen, perhaps I go to you first, and a short 1 minute. What do you see the next developments in the next few months, and that's a highlight for 2023 that we should be aware of?
Oh wow! So firstly, just to say thanks to Mark, both for that really informative presentation, but also just for leading on this work. Generally, we get really good feedback from those who are scheme members who have made use of the template, and so I would encourage you to at least take a look. It's free to use. It's on our website and IA and the ABI's websites. And also, if you do have feedback, as Mark says, we very much the working group wants to see it evolve to meet needs. So feel free to get in touch. Okay, what's in the next year? I mean, I think that the pace of new initiatives will continue. We're expecting consultations in the autumn around taxonomy and sustainable disclosure regulation. I think that it feels to me that the government and schemes and all the various stakeholders are largely on the same page with sort of where we want to get to. So hopefully it will be things will evolve and there'll be some challenges, but I think we're moving in the right direction.
Thanks, Karen. Chandra, over to you. What are your highlights?
Sure. I'd say two highlights looking into 2023. One is being in the UK European side, and the other one being international or global. The transition planning initiatives that the government has put forth, I think, will become a pretty big part of focus next year as companies start reporting on their climate transition plans. There's the transition plan task force that is setting out best practices, et cetera. So that's one to look out for, because we'll be moving beyond TCFD to not just emissions and metrics, but also around transition planning across portfolio companies. And the other thing is the ISSB, which is sort of lines up on the same climate disclosure point, but going beyond TCFD again and building on it to make it broader, much more materiality based, much more sort of inclusive of other things like just transition and natural capital, etc. That making it standardized on a global scale. So I think these are the two things. The TCFD has been a fantastic foundation, but I think it will definitely evolve over time. And where these two initiatives go will pretty much determine how climate reporting sort of progresses in its natural sort of maturation over the next year. So.
Great, thank you. Yes, stay tuned, watch this space. Mark, and what, you mentioned the updates that you're working on, and obviously Chandra just mentioned that the transition in planning and lots of questions around taxonomy. Looking into your crystal ball, where do you see the next template to be emerging in this sort of space?
Yeah, I think the template will be an evolution. I think we'll probably go through a number of iterations. Certainly there'll be a version 2 by the end of this year. I anticipate a version 3 next year. And I think if we get good engagement with the template and produce a set of standards that provide common methodologies, it will be beneficial. It will make it easier to provide the data. It will be easier to consume the data and process it, and then put the energies within schemes into doing something with that and reporting on it, rather than spending a lot of time trying to get data, trying to standardize it, trying to understand the differences. So I think that's key. A fairly perhaps niche area, the LGPS that we've touched on. It's great that the core requirements look very, very similar to the private sector. The interesting thing there will be that we have the pools inserted between the asset managers and the actual schemes themselves. So that adds a layer of complexity in that data chain.
Right, thank you, Mark. Right, so I think we're up. We're unfortunately our 45 minutes is up. But thank you very much to Mark, to Chandra, and to Karen for a very extensive, great whirlwind of all the matters regarding TCFD. It's been very insightful, very interesting. So lots of good takeaways. As we said, please do use the emissions template. It's on the PLSA website. It's also on the Investment Association's website. We're here to help. We're here to make this as painless as possible. And as we've been hearing, this is a journey. This is an evolution. This needs engagement on all sides of the table. So we look forward to continuing these discussions, and stay tuned to our next policy update. Thank you very much. Thank you, Mark. Thank you, Karen. Thank you, Chandra. And thank you to our audience. All the best.